Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Weltlich Ehr und zeitlich gut, which translates to worldly honor and temporal good. Fairly straightforward chorale, has a couple of interesting tidbits here and there. There is one typo. For some reason, accidentals are being omitted in my engraving software, so I have to go back in and add them. I don't want to waste paper by reprinting when I make a typo like that, so I'm just going to handwrite them in. But this is an F sharp here, not an F natural. If this were an F natural, it'd be a very interesting cadence, but the F sharp doesn't make it so interesting. So relatively straightforward chorale. I don't think there's too much to write home about here. One or two instances of things that I've been tracking for my own individual research, but other than that, fairly straightforward. So we're just going to hop right into the analysis. We don't have a key signature. We start with C major and we end with C major, so I reckon the overall tonality of this chorale is C major. Passing tones in the bass and the alto. We then get E, G, G, and B, which is E minor. It's actually kind of alluding or foreshadowing the fact that E minor is going to be an important chord in this chorale. So we have a 3 chord here in root position, or sorry, yeah, it's a 3 chord in root position, and this C sort of turns into an anticipation for the chord on the next beat. However, I feel like 3 here is operating as a substitute for 1-6. We typically would see a tonic triad in first inversion happening, especially after these passing tones. But yeah, E minor ends up playing a very integral role in this chorale. We then have F, C, G, and A. This is our 4 chord F major with a 9/8 suspension in over the bass and the alto here. It's very common to see 9/8 suspensions over root position tonic triads. It's kind of interesting because E minor, if this were a diminished chord, would be like the leading tone chord to F, and F would be tonicized here, but it's not. So it's interesting to see a 9/8 suspension over a chord that isn't a tonic triad. Typically 9/8 suspensions, if we don't see them over tonic triads, are common over 4 chords as well. So we have this little neighbor tone here in the bass, and then we get the resolution to our suspension after this little neighboring 7th here, F, C, F, and A. No need to reanalyze. Passing 7th in the bass, and then we get D minor, D, D, F, and A. It's our 2 chord. Thirds bass progressions where we see chords that are, a third apart regarding their roots. It's common to see at least 1 buffer tone between them. It's uncommon to see 2 chords just purely harmonic rhythm to harmonic rhythm that are a third apart. Like chords that are a third apart usually have some type of buffer chord or even a subdivided chord progression in between them. F is a chord tone, we don't have to mark it. A is a chord tone, so we don't have to mark it. We then have G, E, G, and B. Another E minor chord here. We would expect a 5 chord here, but instead we get 3 in first inversion, which is kind of like a sub for 5. And we get some passing tones in the lower voices, which actually takes our chord and turns it into a 5 chord. F, D, G, and B. Happens to be a 5 chord in third inversion, G7 over F. And then we get what we would expect afterwards, our tonic triad in first inversion, E, C, G, and C. With a little passing 7th here in the melody. We then have F, C, G, and A, another 9/8 suspension over our 4 chord. It's kind of interesting about the overall profile of this phrase and the chorale in general. And then we get a plagal cadence here, where we go from 4 to 1, C, C, E, and G. At the 4/3 suspension over the bass. 4/3 suspensions are usually most common over dominant chords. We do see them over other chords as well, like in this case, and probably the most common deviation from that is when we see a 4/3 suspension in a cadential context like this. But afterwards, we start the next phrase. We get a modulation to the key of A minor, here where we end with the half cadence, but we stay in C major for the majority of the phrase. So we have G, D, G, and B to start things off. That's our 5 chord. Then we get C, E, G, and C, tonic triad, root position. E briefly takes our chord and puts it in first inversion before we get another G major chord, G, D, G, and B. It's our 5 chord, passing 7th in the bass, and then we get our tonic in first inversion, E, C, G, and C. C is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. And then we get F, C, F, and A, which is our 4 chord, F major, passing 7th in the bass. And then we get B, D, F, and B. Sorry, this is D, D, F, and B, which is B diminished over D. B here actually takes the chord and briefly puts it in root position before we get E, B, E, and G. So we see 7 going to 3 here, so following the cycle of falling fifths. Seeing a lot of E minor chords in this chorale. Passing 7th in the bass, and then we have C, A, E, and A, which is our 6 chord in first inversion, 3 going to 6. We have a kind of a long cycle of falling fifths progression that can even go as far back as this 5 chord here. 5, 1, 4, 7, 3, 6. We would expect this to go to a 2 chord, but instead 6 is the sort of the end of the line. I think even though we could mark this as our modulation to the key of A minor, it wouldn't really make too much of a difference if we did. I'm going to say it happens after these passing tones in the lower voices here. We have A, C, E, and A, just some voice exchange happening in the lower voices here, which just takes our A minor chord and puts it in root position. I don't really think it makes too much of a difference whether you say the modulation happens here at this A minor in first inversion over this root position A minor chord, because they're effectively the same chord. My logic is that what makes this A minor chord any more A minor-like than this A minor chord? And I don't think that there's a compelling enough reason in the texture to choose one over the other. So I'm generally consistent when it comes to marking the modulations as late as possible. And then we have the voice exchange again, which takes the chord and puts it in first inversion before we get E major. E, G sharp, E, and B, which is our 5 chord. So this next phrase is a bit interesting. We end in the key of A minor again, but we start the phrase off with some pretty heavy tonic implications regarding E minor. So I think we have a direct modulation to E minor to start off the phrase. We have E major on one side of the rest and E minor on the other side, so it feels like a juxtaposition of similar but unlike triads. E minor takes us to its dominant, D sharp, B, F sharp, and B, which is B major over D sharp. A is a chordal 7th, and F sharp is our chord tone, which is like taking our chord and putting it, keeping it in first inversion, but adding the 7th. And then we get E minor afterwards. E, F sharp, it's a 9/8 suspension here, and then E and A. We have a double suspension. That's something that I didn't catch in my original notes, but we have E, E, G, and B. It's our tonic triad in root position. And then we get kind of an interesting elision here. We could say that E minor is a minor dominant if you wanted to, but I feel like that's not really the case here. I think even if we were thinking in E minor terms, F sharp would be just as much an E minor tone than it was the 6th for A minor, even though we see that E is part of a larger A melodic minor scale fragment. So here we have F sharp, E, F sharp, and A. I think actually this E is a 7/6 suspension over the bass, even though you could analyze this as 7/6/5, or sorry, no, sorry, 6/7 in the key of A minor, as well as 2/7 in the key of E minor. I think it's actually this D that's the chord tone here. I think this is a 7 chord in first inversion. Sorry, not a 7, a 6 chord. A 7/6 chord, D major over F sharp, that's also turning into a 4/6 chord in the key of A minor. But it's mostly minutia because both of the chords are sort of operating in the same pre-dominant fashion. We then get G sharp, B, E, and B, which is E major over G sharp. The C is an accented non-chord tone, which would be a 5/6 chord, and 4/6 going to 5/6 in this ascending configuration is super common in Bach, in the chorales at least. And then we get our tonic triad, A, E, and C, which is in root position. And I think that this actually ends up being our gateway to the keys of C major for the next phrase, where it's now our 6th chord. And even though we move to the key of C major for the next measure, we end the phrase with an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of G major. So we start the phrase off with B, D, D and G, which is a 5/6 chord, G major over B, and then F here is our chordal seventh. It turns into a suspension on the next beat, another 4/3 suspension over a tonic triad, and also another double suspension where we have a 9/8 over our tonic, really similar to the double suspension we had in the previous phrase over our E minor chord. So C, C, E, and G is really the chord that's being implied here. And then we have the resolution with a little, I think it's a neighbor tone. Yeah, it's a neighbor tone here in the tenor, but I think this is where we actually move to the key of G major and it turns into our 4 chord. And on the next beat, we have F sharp, C, D, and A. I think this E is a 7/6 suspension over the bass. I mean, you could analyze this as a, 7 half diminished, but I think this is actually a 5/6/5 chord. It's difficult to say, it's a toss-up. I think in other analyses I've called it a 7/7 chord. I just hear the D is the root of this chord, so it is what it is, because regardless of how you analyze it, it is a dominant chord, functionally speaking. So we would expect 5 to go to 1, which it does, or 7, G, B, D, and B. Both of those would go to 1. Passing 7th in the bass, passing tone in the tenor as well, which gives us actually F sharp, A, D, and B, which is like a 3 chord in first inverse, a 3/7 chord in second inversion. And that takes us to E, G, C, and C. 3 often goes to 4, so I will mark that. And C, E, and G are all chord tones. They're just taking the chord and putting it in root position before we get D, D, G, and A. This is our 5 chord, D major. It's very common to see 4/3 suspensions over root position dominant triads. Here's an example of that. F sharp is the 3rd of the chord, G is just a 4th above the bass, and then we get our resolution. G, D, G, and B. Root position tonic triad. Okay, next phrase is also in the key of G major. We get another imperfect authentic cadence. We have G, D, G, and B again. No need to reanalyze. A, C, F sharp, and A, C, F sharp, and C, which is our 7 chord in first inversion. And we see a pattern that's very common in the chorales. B, B, G, and D. This 1-7-6-1-6 progression is super common in patterns. They use that same chordal relationship of 2 similar triads that are separated by an inversion, bridged by a chord that's a diatonic step below. Passing 7th in the tenor before we get G sharp, E, B, and D, which is E7 over G sharp, 5/6/5 of 2, because E is the dominant of A. And then we get A minor, A, E, A, and C. So we don't modulate in this case. This is just a secondary dominant. We have some passing tones in the bass and the alto as well, which actually kind of gives us a passing... it is kind of interesting, actually. We have B, E, G, and C, which is kind of like a 2-4-2 chord, actually. C major 7 over B. And it actually, the reason why I think this chord is kind of significant now that I'm looking at it is because of what's happening on the next beat too, because we have on the harmonic rhythm C, D, F sharp, and A. So we have D on the next beat, which is a chord tone. So inclined to think that this is just a 5 chord, but the 4/2 is there in the bass, which is kind of confusing. We don't know whether or not the 4 is like actually what's happening here, or if the bass is just a half beat behind and really the roots are happening just 1/8 note after the harmonic rhythm. And 4/2 chords typically resolve down by step. I can't think of too many situations where 4/2 chords, getting tongue-tied today, 4/2 chords don't resolve down by step. At least the roots are hit or miss in some situations. They're usually consistent by the relationship of a 5th below, but in this case it seems to be kind of interesting that these 4/2 chords aren't operating the way that we would expect, but I think that there's a reason behind that. Regardless, 5, if we just look at the roots and the way that they are related to one another, the 5 goes to 1. G, D, G, and B. Tonic triad root position. Okay, our next cadence is a deceptive cadence, and it has that F sharp there. Just the engraving software did not export the F sharp, so I was definitely listening for that and just confused as to why it sounded so angular. By Bach standards, like there was like some weird modality going on, but regardless, it's okay. It got all sorted out. This phrase ends in the key of G major, but we do see movement to the key of C major in the middle of the phrase before we go back to G, which I think is kind of interesting. We start the phrase off with D major, D, F sharp, A, and D, passing 7th, and another passing tone in the tenor. We have B, D, G, and D, which is 1/6. Passing tones in the lower 3 voices. We don't really have an analyzable chord here. We have A, C, A, and D. Maybe there's like a passing 7 chord implied here without the root, or an A minor chord in passing here without the 5th. But that takes us to our tonic triad and root position. G, B, B, and D, which is our tonic triad and root position. And with this F natural in the bass here, we also have a passing tone in the alto. I think that this is now operating as 5 in the key of C, or this is 5 of 4, and we're still in the key of G major. However, I think that with F also happening here and not seeing it reversed until right before the cadence, I'm inclined to think that we do have this very quick departure to C major. However, you could analyze this whole section in the key of G major if you wanted to as well. We have E, B, G, and D, which is E minor 7 in root position. Yeah, we've seen this chord with quite a bit of frequency. Just E minor in general. 3 chords are relatively uncommon in Bach's writing, but we have been seeing them, you know, quite a bit. So it's interesting that this chorale has a higher usage of 3. It's a unique profile. But then we get D, which is a chord tone, because this is an E minor 7 chord, B, F natural, and D, which is B minor 7 flat 5, or B half diminished in first inversion, which is like 7, 6, 5. Wait, no, there's no A in this chord. It would just be a 7, 6 chord. Apologies. Yeah, so this is an example of what I was previously calling a transitive chord progression. If you've watched my videos in the past, chances are you will have come across a transitive chord progression. Typically, chords move a 5th down or a 4th up. They're the same thing, but here we have it moving a 5th up from 3 to 7. Typically, we expect 7 to go to 3, like we see here, but sometimes we see Bach use the same voice leading to take us the other way, so 3 going to 7, and presumably to 1, so just another way of approaching a dominant functioning chord that will then eventually take us to our tonic or to some stable harmony. C, C, E, and E, which is our tonic triad and root position, and coincidentally I think this is the place where we go to the key of G and it becomes our 4 chord because we get F sharp on the next beat. We get D, A, F sharp, and D, which is just our 5 chord in root position with the passing 7th in the melody. And instead of cadencing on G major, we get E minor, E, E, G, and B. So a 4, 5, 6 progression, pretty cool. And then we get our final phrase, which ends in a perfect authentic cadence in the key of C, but we spend the majority of the time in this phrase in the key of G, so no modulations just yet. We start off with G major, G, D, G, and B, tonic triad, passing 7th in the tenor, in the alto, and then we get C, oh apologies, I missed something there. This is an F natural, so this makes me feel like G is operating not just as our tonic, but rather as 5 of 4. We'll see if that resolves the way that we would expect it to. And sure enough, after the F natural, we do get C major. We have C, C, E, and G, which is our 4 chord. So that F natural is a tendency tone. It wants to resolve down to E. Not that F sharp wouldn't want to also resolve down to E if it were just continuing down the scale. But in this case, the F natural is a half step from E, so they have more of a kindred relationship, I would say. passing 7th in the bass, and then we get A, C, F sharp, and A. I think this E is a non-chord tone. You could analyze it as 2. It would make sense, right, because that's the chord that's happening on the beat, but I think F sharp makes more sense narratively speaking, because 4 going to 7 is a very common chord progression in Bach, predominant, dominant, and then presumably tonic chord progression, which we see on the next beat, G, D, G, and B, G major in root position. We have a passing tone in the melody as well before we get F sharp, D, A, and D. It's D major over F sharp, which is 5-6. Do we have a C in there too? No, we have a passing 7th here in the melody, so maybe a 5-6-5 chord, but probably just a 5-6 chord if I were the one analyzing, which I am, but I think 5-6-5, and also just all the 7 chords that we've seen up until this point in the analyses. If there's a passing 7th, you could just analyze that as part of the greater chord as well, but I tend to not do that. But afterwards we get G major in root position, G, D, G, and B, and here we see a 9/8 suspension over a tonic triad. That's typically where 9/8 suspensions are most commonly found in the chorales, over root position tonic triads. And with F natural on the next beat, I do think this is operating as our 5 now as well, in the key of not G. Sorry, I was thinking of the G major chord, but rather in the key of C. We have D, D, G, and A. I think this G is a 4/3 suspension over our bass. F natural, we have another transitive progression here where in the same way that we see 3 go to 7, here we see 5 go to 2. And we also see a 4/3 suspension over our D minor chord, which is kind of interesting because we typically expect 4/3 suspensions over dominant triads, and this is not a dominant triad. But this is also a very interesting sounding cadence because C major kind of gets just slipped up. It just gets like slipped into the texture here, which is, yeah, it's just an interesting sound. A little neighbor tone there as well before we get G, D, F, and B. G7 in root position, it's our 5 chord. E's a little passing embellishment. D is a chord tone. G is a chord tone as well, so we don't have to mark it. And then we get C major, C, G, E, and C. Tonic triad, root position. That is our analysis for today. Apologies for being so tongue-tied. I'm dealing with allergies and I have a little bit of brain fog. I was considering whether or not I wanted to record the video today, but I got through it, and yeah, this chorale was relatively straightforward to analyze. Other than the use of 3 proportionately more than we see in the average chorale, a couple of takeaways are these 4/2 chords that we see at the end of this phrase here. Are they really 4/2 chords, or is it just counterpoint that's sort of lagging a half beat behind? It's difficult to say, but I do think it's worth mentioning. We get a ton of mid-phrase modulations in this chorale. It's much more common for Bach to modulate to a key and end in the key that he modulates to, but in this case we see Bach moving from key to key within the phrase, which is something he does with quite a bit of regularity, but it is objectively less common than him picking a key and sticking with it once he modulates to it within a phrase. And then we also get some double suspensions going on as well. We have a 9/8 and 4/3 suspension going on here, and another one doing the same thing here at the end of the first system. But on those thoughts, I think I'm going to cap off the video. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You can hit the notification icon and like the video as well if you enjoyed the content. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.